Victor James, a 40-something man, was a man of money and was sure that there was nothing that could not be bought. Tall and well-groomed, he was the epitome of success and sophistication. He wore tailor-made suits, distinguished the aromas of expensive drinks, and found pleasure in it. His work brought in enough income to be carefree in business and a little frivolous in entertainment. Victor saw himself as a man who always got his way, and this applied not only to business but also to personal pleasures. He was used to the stares of women, no matter his age or younger, and to always being the center of attention. So when he spotted Lexi at the bar, he knew this girl wouldn't leave the club without his attention. This Friday night didn't seem to portend anything special. The club hummed with its usual rhythm, neon lights shimmered on the dance floor, and a crowd of young people mingled with older customers ready to submit to the frenzied rhythm of music and the heady alcohol. Victor stood in the corner, holding a glass of whiskey and scrutinizing the room until his gaze fell on a slender figure at the bar. Lexi looked like she'd come here just to be noticed. Her dark curls cascaded over her bare shoulders, and the daring dress emphasized her youthful freshness. 18 Victor already knew her age before they exchanged their first words. She was someone who was easily charmed. Her eyes, shining with curiosity and readiness for new experiences, quickly succumbed to his appealing gaze and self-assured smile. It was moments like these that Victor considered hunting, and he hunted skillfully. He approached the bar and ordered a cocktail for Lexi, wasting no words on introductions, just leaving her as the focus of his attention. She turned around curiously, raising an eyebrow slightly as if surprised by his insistence, but at the same time flattered by his attention. There was something different about him, something her peers didn't possess: strength, confidence, firmness. She smelled his expensive perfume, subtle woody notes with a slight tinge of tobacco, and intuitively realized that a completely different life awaited her next to this man. Victor spoke in an even, calm tone, as if he didn't want to hurry and was enjoying the moment. He took his time charming her with his words, leaving room for her imagination. Lexi, as if bewitched, listened attentively to his speech and laughed when he joked, seeing something new and desirable in him. Their evening passed casually, and Victor offered to walk her home. In parting, he carelessly left his business card and suggested they meet again. Lexi took it discreetly, as if she wasn't sure she wanted him yet, though her heart was already beating faster. For the next few weeks, he set about charming her not with words, but with deeds. Victor thought out every move. He became her source of luxury, which she was getting used to all too quickly. He took her to restaurants that served dishes she had never heard the name of before, and the waiters gave her coats to her when they left the place without a word. He gave her gifts that made her blush and lose her breath, but she soon got used to them branded handbags, gold pendants, and even the first late-model cell phone she'd ever owned. Lexi played the role he expected her to play, obedient and grateful, always willing to be there for him when he wanted her to be. But every time he came home, Lexi shed that role like an uncomfortable dress. Yes, he was her sugar daddy, but she knew that deep down he was just a stepping stone, a bridge to what she thought was her true world. Victor, naive in his conceit, saw only what he wanted to see: a grateful girl, obedient to his words and gestures. But in reality, he was just a way for her to reach the level she always dreamed of. Soon, another man came into her life: Tony. They were introduced by mutual friends at a local cafe that Victor would never have agreed to go to. Tony was her age, and something cheeky, irritating, but attractive immediately flared up between them. The guy was sharp-tongued, and his mockery of Victor gave Lexi a quiet thrill and a sense of belonging to something personal. "What do you need him for, that old man?" Tony said, rolling his eyes when she mentioned Victor. "Showing you this world of riches, and you're still with us because he's boring, isn't he?" And there was something true in his words. Lexi felt like her connection to Victor was nothing more than a ticket to this high level, but it was getting harder and harder to go back to him each time. She was more attracted to the world of her peers, where she wasn't an obedient girl, but a rebel living for her own pleasure. Gifts from Victor became the subject of discussion in the company of friends, as well as dinners in expensive restaurants, which they told about at school parties with a slightly mocking subtext. Tony frankly despised Victor. He was hurt by the way Lexi was being privileged by the man, and though he kept quiet when looking at her new jewelry or upgraded phone, Lexi could sense the underlying jealousy in him. Sometimes she tried not to mention Victor so as not to anger Tony. Other times, on the contrary, she deliberately reminded herself of his attentions so she could experience the pleasure of the reproach in Tony's eyes. In this way, her life was divided into two opposite roles. Victor thought he knew her like no one else, but he was unaware of her attraction to Tony. He believed this young girl was his own creation, gentle and grateful, willing to follow his demands. But Lexi was no longer the same. The girl who had recently raved about his gifts was now returning to him with a sense of satiety and even inner contempt. Tony caused her emotions of a different kind: tension, irritation, sometimes even disappointment, but he was the fire that smoldered in her and demanded to be rekindled. When Victor left on a business trip, Lexi felt light for the first time in a long time. His stern gaze, always present even in phone conversations, disappeared, and she felt free. A daring thought flashed through her mind. Why not spend the evening at his place? His apartment, located in an upscale neighborhood, was luxuriously furnished and different from the typical places she was used to spending her time: large windows overlooking the city at night, a spacious living room with expensive furniture, and the sound system Victor liked to show off to his guests. She knew the code to the door and was sure she could arrange everything without anyone finding out. She immediately voiced that idea to Tony, and then to her friends. Her peers were excited about the idea of having a party at a cool place, and not just any place, but at her own sugar daddy's house. The whole group gathered in the parking lot in front of the house, talking and waiting for Lexi to open the door. She entered the code and the guys followed her inside. Victor's apartment was perfectly quiet, broken only by the muffled sounds of the distant city outside the window. It was unusual. Everything seemed foreign and inaccessible here. Even though today it belonged to them, Lexi opened the bar full of expensive bottles and put out glasses. The first minutes passed in silent surprise. No one could believe that they were here, and that this place was open to them, as if it was a place from another life. But as soon as Lexi laughed and raised her glass, her friends perked up. Soon the apartment was filled not only with laughter, but also with music pouring from the speakers, the hum of conversations and laughs. Glasses were filled and clinked, cigarettes enveloped the rooms in smoke, and the atmosphere gradually became more and more relaxed and free. It occurred to someone to turn on louder music, and no one objected. The soft light of the lamps and the reflection of the night city in the glass walls added to the magic of what was happening, creating a sense of luxury for everyone present. Soon the conversations began, and the topic was, of course, Victor. Lexi, a little tipsy, began to talk about their encounters, strange gifts, how he controlled her, and what he demanded in return. The stories about Victor elicited only ridicule and teasing. The guys never missed an opportunity to talk about how ridiculous Victor looked next to a young girl, and made sarcastic comments about old men in need of young blood. Tony especially stood out among them, teasing Lexi and venting his outrage. Does he even realize that you look like his granddaughter next to him? The laughter, fueled by alcohol and feelings, grew louder and louder. Lexi, feeling a kind of power over the situation, was also giving in to the excitement. Her friends, pouring themselves from expensive bottles, laughed at the idea that Victor had unknowingly paid for the party. In the midst of the fun, Lexi and Tony stood at the window, staggering slightly, looking out at the nighttime city. He put his hand on her shoulder and leaned over to her ear, conspiratorially whispering something that made her laugh again. This was their moment, a moment when she seemed free to him, not subject to any rule. She felt like this night finally belonged to her, not Victor. But their fun was interrupted by the sudden and sharp sound of the door opening. Everyone turned around. In the corridor, on the threshold of the apartment, stood Victor. His face had turned pale. His eyes glittered furiously with anger. He stopped like a stumbling block, assessing what was happening. The guests of his apartment, unfamiliar teenagers, froze in fright. Someone dropped a glass, which shattered on the marble floor, adding a deafening clink to the silence. "What's going on here?" Victor literally spat out those words. His voice echoed through the apartment like thunder, breaking the strained silence. No one dared to answer. His gaze was fixed on Lexi, standing next to Tony. She pulled away from him, trying to hide her embarrassment, but her eyes read fear and confusion. Victor strode across the room, glancing around quickly and angrily at the guests who didn't know where to put themselves. Clenching his fists, he turned to Lexi, accusing her of betrayal. He yelled that he trusted her, that he thought she was different, and that she had disappointed him by letting a bunch of people he didn't know into his house. Lexi tried to say something, but her attempts to justify herself drowned in his anger. She knew that now this evening would be the end of their arrangement. Victor moved closer to push Lexi out, but Tony stood in front of him, not about to let her stay under the man's pressure. He interrupted Victor by shouting loudly, "You've had your say, old man. Leave her alone." Victor frowned, his eyes glittering coldly. In the dim light of the room, they seemed ready to burn through, but he had no time to answer. The tension in the air became unbearable. Everyone froze, watching the conflict. Lexi suddenly realized that her world was crumbling right before her eyes. She had never imagined that Victor could return so unexpectedly and put her in a situation from which it was impossible to get out of without loss. She tried to calm Victor down, but he wasn't listening anymore. He was kicking everyone out, threatening to call the police if they didn't get out of his apartment. There was not just frustration in his eyes, but a cold rage that left her with no chance of forgiveness. One by one, her friends left the apartment, looking around and whispering, unable to believe they'd been a part of this strange and frightening conflict. Lexi stood in front of him, backed up against the wall, not knowing where to escape his gaze. He couldn't choose his words. Accusations and taunts rained down on her like a rain of icy needles. Victor called her a traitor, a mercenary girl who, in his words, only knows how to take. Lexi tried to respond, but he interrupted her over and over, not letting her get a word in edgewise. Trying to withstand his onslaught, Lexi was taking a step back when she felt Tony's hand squeeze her shoulder as if protecting her. Victor narrowed his eyes unhappily and threw him a scornful look. At that moment, Tony couldn't take it anymore. "Who the hell are you to yell at her like that anyway? Sugar daddy? How sweet," he spat out, grinning. "You think money gives you the right to do anything? You don't even know who I am, boy," Victor said coldly, stepping forward as if he meant to shove him out the door again. "Both you and your friends are nobodies, dirt underfoot until I allow you something more." Lexi instinctively reached for Tony, but Victor roughly pushed her aside, stepping toward him closely. Their gazes met as Victor, tall and powerful, towered over him, but Tony, fists clenched, remained motionless, grinning caustically and not averting his gaze. He wasn't going to give up either. "Leave her alone, okay? You don't own her, understand?" Tony said mockingly, realizing how annoyed he was making Victor. "One thing is clear," Victor replied, his eyes glittering with anger. "It's time for you to get out of here." Tony couldn't stand it any longer, and clenching his teeth, shoved Victor roughly. It was an instant, a flash in which everything happened before anyone in the room realized what was happening. Victor took a step backwards, unable to keep his feet from the sharp push, and slipped on the smooth floor, his hand reaching for the wall in an attempt to hold on, but he lost his balance. The glass shattered as Victor hit the glass display case behind him, his body breaking through the fragile glass and settling to the floor, the red stains on his shirt quickly spreading wider and wider. The remnants of the window shards crumbled to the floor around him, tinkling like raindrops. Lexi covered her mouth with her hand in horror, unable to believe her eyes. Tony, frozen, dropped his hands, watching Victor. His friends, who were standing by the door, backed away as if trying to escape from the terrifying reality. No one realized how serious it was. Victor remained on the floor, his face turned toward the ceiling, his blood-stained chest heaving faintly. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the room. Lexi took a few steps forward, trying to see if he was alive. But the look on his face, pale, contorted with pain, spoke for itself. Her heart was racing. She wanted to go to him, to help him, but her fear held her so tight that her legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. Everything was happening as if in slow motion. "We need to leave." Lexi finally squeezed out, her voice muffled and choppy. "Are you crazy?" one of her friends snapped at her. "He's bleeding to death! We can't just leave! If we stay, we'll all go to jail!" Lexi hissed, struggling to control her panic. "Don't you understand? If we're connected to this, it'll be our fault!" One of the friends wanted to say something, but Tony interrupted him, clearly losing all his fighting spirit. "Lexi's right. We can't stay." His voice sounded firm, but the fear in his eyes gave away the doubt. "No one can know we were here." Lexi nodded, hoping they would all be convinced by her determination. The pounding of her own heart overrode all the sounds in the room, and she couldn't distinguish who was saying what she was gripped by only one thought. Get away and forget this ever happened. Feeling weak and faint, she took one last look at Victor, lying in a pool of blood. They left the apartment one by one, avoiding eye contact and trying not to make a sound. They left Victor bleeding on the cold floor that night, hoping that no one would ever know the truth. Of course, I'll only fix the moment with the discs, keeping the rest of the text intact. The morning greeted Lexi with a thud in her temples and a painful realization of what had happened last night. She didn't immediately recall all the details. Only snippets came to mind. Victor's loud screams, his fall into the storefront, the blood pouring onto the floor, the confused faces of her friends. But one thought pierced her completely, making her blood freeze in her veins. There could be cameras in Victor's apartment. She'd seen firsthand his attitude toward security, his habit of controlling everything around him. The possibility that their actions were recorded weighed on her like a stone around her neck. Lexi sat in the small room in her apartment, pressing her fingers to her temples. Her gaze was blank, but her mind was swarming with thoughts. She remembered Victor talking about the cameras that had been installed, but always carelessly mentioning that he kept the recordings for his own peace of mind, to always make sure I was safe. Even though he had never told her where the cameras were, she realized it was her only chance to go back and try to destroy the evidence. A pounding heartbeat accompanied her all the way to Victor's apartment. The anxious tension grew with each step down the hallway leading to his door. Trying to calm herself, she exhaled slowly and entered the code. She felt like the whole house was watching her, that someone was about to see her and ask questions, but all was quiet. Stepping inside, Lexi froze. Victor was still lying on the floor, his body frozen in an unnatural pose, surrounded by shards of the display case and gore. A cold dread gripped her, but she forced herself to walk past, avoiding looking that way, and moved toward the office where she guessed Victor kept his notes. On a desk in the corner was a small, almost invisible safe. Lexi knew the code, which Victor had once said casually, confident that she could be trusted. She entered the numbers and heard a short click as the safe opened. Inside was a wad of money and several discs of records with old dates on them. The current disc was probably in a unit connected to the cameras. Lexi took the money, slammed the safe shut. Something had to be done about last night's videotape right away, but she knew one person who could help. A club acquaintance named Jay was a shady guy with a strange reputation. He had offered to help Lexi and her friends for money on more than one occasion, solving all sorts of issues when someone needed to get something down or out of the way. Lexi pulled out her cell phone and, standing in Victor's apartment, quickly dialed his number. "Jay, I need help," she mumbled, trying to keep her voice steady. "What is it?" Jay answered sleepily, but when he heard Lexi's serious tone, he switched gears. "Is this about last night's party?" "Yeah. Victor has cameras, and I don't know where to find the footage." Jay hummed when he heard that, but immediately asked, "Okay, do you see something like a small unit or box with cables connected to it? It must be somewhere in the study or near the router." Lexi looked around and noticed a small black box under the desk, hidden behind a pile of wires and papers. She quickly crouched down to get a closer look at it. "Found it. What's next?" "Take a picture of the connection, the model, and see if there's a network address," Jay replied. "If it's writing to the server, I need to know where to connect. I'll have to pay for that." Lexi acquiesced, quickly taking a few pictures and then sending them to Jay, staring at the screen with anxious anticipation as he studied the photos. "Okay, it's clear how everything is set up," he replied after a little while. "I'll connect and clean it up if it was being sent to the server, but still, you'll have to take the disk itself out of the unit." Without it, we can't guarantee that someone won't recover the files. She took a deep breath and gently pulled the disk out of the unit, feeling her palms sweating from the strain. The disk was small and fragile, and as she held it in her hands, she felt that her fate now literally depended on this small device. "It's done," she whispered into the phone, holding the disk with trembling hands. "Okay, give it to me when you get out. I'll check it out and do whatever I need to do," Jay reassured her, then added, "It won't be cheap, but you know." Lexi finally exhaled, feeling a faint sense of relief, even though she realized that this situation was only the beginning of her fears. Tucking the disk into her bag, she quickly left the apartment, trying not to look back at the body lying in the living room. When Victor didn't show up for work and stopped answering his cell phone, his co-workers began to worry. For a man of his position and discipline, such sudden silence was highly unusual, and it immediately aroused suspicion. At first, they thought he was late for a meeting or had postponed his plans, but the day was drawing to a close and there was no word or response from him. One of the employees finally decided to call the police to check Victor's apartment. The police arrived in the evening. The door was locked, but after getting permission to look around, the officers went inside. They were greeted by a frightening silence. The atmosphere was tense, as if time had stopped in the apartment. As they looked through the living room, the officers immediately came upon a gruesome scene. Victor was lying on the floor, surrounded by the shards of a broken display case and caked blood. His body was motionless, his eyes were closed, and his face was contorted in a painful grimace. The investigation team began to document everything they could in detail. Shoe prints and traces of blood were found on the living room floor, and the room itself looked as if there had been a sharp argument or struggle. One of the detectives noticed a safe and a camera unit with a disc plugged into it. Upon opening it, they discovered that the recording disc was missing. This raised questions for the detectives. Where could the disc drive have gone if the apartment was locked, and Victor himself clearly couldn't have removed it? Fingerprints were also recorded at the scene, and eventually forensic experts determined that a significant portion of them belonged to a group of young men. This further confused the investigation, as Victor was not known to take teenagers to his house. Who were these people? The detectives began to build a theory and soon had their identities. One by one, all the teens present in the apartment were called in for questioning. Lexi was the first to be questioned, and her confident, almost cold calmness alerted the detectives. She seemed completely confident in her answers. Lexi confirmed that she and her friends had been at Victor's apartment, and she explained that he had allowed them to gather there to have a little fun while he was away on business. According to her, Victor was alive and calm when he left, and she did not notice anything out of the ordinary. Victor said that he was going away for a couple days, and that I could invite some friends over, Lexi explained, without raising her gaze to the detective, as if trying to prevent him from catching her in the slightest hesitation. "We just sat around, had a few drinks, and left when it got late. No one even thought anything like that could have happened." Her answers sounded clear, like memorized lines. The detective conducting the interview noticed that she never once stammered or showed any embarrassment. Nevertheless, her story remained logical and plausible. If Victor himself had given permission, the presence of a group of young people in his apartment would not seem like a violation. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Lexi was not telling the truth. A few days later, after a series of interviews, the investigation hit a dead end. All the teens questioned in the case confirmed Lexi's version of events. They had come to the apartment at her invitation and in agreement with Victor. Lexi confidently asserted that the last time she had seen him was when he had packed up and left on a business trip. She emphasized that Victor himself had authorized their meeting, and no strange events had occurred that evening. Each of the teens adhered to this version. When the detectives asked about the videotapes, they all said that they hadn't seen any cameras or recordings, and that Victor probably just hadn't mentioned it, deciding to keep his presence a secret. None of Lexi's friends exhibited any emotion that might indicate their involvement in the tragedy, not even Tony, who, detectives noted, seemed overly confident in his statement. However, the disappearance of the current footage from the cameras continued to raise suspicions. Officers suspected the footage may have been deleted, but had no technical ability to prove when it happened or who was involved. The investigation team analyzed the recording unit itself and found that the media was missing, probably manually deleted. But that wasn't enough to incriminate anyone in particular. Medical examiners determined that Victor's death was due to blood loss caused by cuts from the glass, and that he had been dying for several hours after the injury. However, detectives did not have a single clue that could indicate that anyone was around when he died. Testimony from the teens confirmed that they allegedly left long before he died, but none of them could say exactly when they left the apartment, citing alcohol and the general party atmosphere. The detectives were discussing the case behind closed doors, and the offices were becoming increasingly tense. Lexi's too cold-blooded for someone her age. Her testimony leaves us no room for doubt, and that's the weird thing, one of the investigators said. She repeats the same wording without thinking. It's as if she's prepared in advance. But we have no direct evidence of her guilt, reminded his colleague, flipping through the interview notes. All the teenagers say the same thing. They came, drank, and left. No one saw what happened after they left. Even if she's guilty, we have nothing to incriminate her. The investigation was a dead end. Every witness claimed to know that Victor had allowed them to meet at his house, and no one was changing their story. The detectives began to realize that without more evidence, their case was doomed to failure. The investigation was slowly but surely coming to a dead end. The detectives interviewed all possible witnesses, thoroughly examined the apartment and studied the evidence found, but no clear picture was formed. Things changed every time one of the teens corroborated Lexi's testimony. The only thing that still kept the detectives on edge was the lack of surveillance footage. Suddenly, however, an unexpected witness appeared. Victor's co-worker, his close friend David. David called the station himself, insisting that he had important information. He came to the meeting gloomy and agitated. "There's something I need to tell you," he began at once, nervously glancing around at the assembled detectives. "We're listening to you carefully," the senior detective replied, watching his reaction carefully. Victor was a very cautious man, especially when it came to personal items. You must have seen his safe in his office, right? Sure. We examined it, but it was locked and everything looked to be in its place," the detective confirmed, frowning. David took a deep breath and continued. "You see, there's a small camera inside this safe. Victor installed it to take pictures of anyone who opens the safe. He only told me about it, just in case he needed proof that someone was prying into his personal files." The detectives looked at each other. Such forethought seemed unusual, but not unheard of, especially for a man as cautious and careful as Victor. "Wait, are you saying that if someone opened the safe after his death, we might have a photograph on our hands?" clarified one of the detectives, feeling that this information was becoming more important by the minute. "That's right," David nodded. "And if the photo is one of the people you interrogated, you'll have a powerful clue. The camera activates every time you open it." Having received this information, the detectives immediately went back to Victor's apartment. The safe was still locked and looked the same as usual. After opening it, the detectives began to scrutinize every inch of the interior surface, and in one of the corners, finally noticed a small hidden module, to which they did not immediately pay attention. Inside this module was a flash drive. "It looks like this is the medium with the photos David was talking about," said one of the detectives, carefully removing the flash drive and inserting it into the laptop. Everyone held their breath and waited for the clue to appear on the screen. The last picture popped up on the screen. It showed Lexi standing in front of an open safe. She was holding something in her hands and looking at the contents of the safe, clearly unaware that the camera was taking her picture. There was no fear or confusion on her face, just a calm expression and complete focus on what she was doing. One of the detectives looked closely at the screen and then at his colleagues. "That's Lexi. She came back here after Victor's death to collect the money. But more importantly, she saw his body and didn't even think to call the police. That's not just trying to get the money. It turns out she lied about the last time she saw him," the other detective added. Her actions suggest she knew he was dead and decided to cover it up. The detectives realized that this photo was just the kind of evidence that could uncover the truth about Lexi's role in Victor's death. The next day, when Lexi was called back in for a second interview, she entered the office slightly anxious. but maintained a semblance of calm. She was greeted by two detectives who stared at her intently, giving her the impression that she was no longer just expected to tell the truth. She was ready to be coerced into it. "Have a seat, Lexi," the detective began, pointing to the chair across from her. "We have some new evidence, and it demands an explanation." Lexi didn't seem surprised by the statement, but deep down, she could feel the anxiety building. She nodded and sat down across from them, crossing her arms over her chest. "You already know everything I told you," she tried to say in an indifferent tone that seemed convincing. But instead of the expected questions, the detective silently turned the monitor toward her, and an image from Victor's safe appeared on the screen. A picture of her standing in front of the safe, pulling out money. There was no fear or confusion on her face at that moment, just concentration. Lexi turned pale upon noticing the picture. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. The detective studied her reaction, and the silence lasted so long that the room seemed to fill with tension. "It's you, Lexi," the detective said discreetly. "And we know that this picture was taken after Victor's death. You went back to his apartment, saw his body, and instead of calling for help, you just took the money. We want to hear why." Lexi tried to keep her cool and prepared an answer, trying to sound confident. Yes, I went back to the apartment, but only because Victor promised me money. I just took what he'd already set aside for me. I didn't think it would be a problem." "Lexi," the detective interrupted her, staring intently into her eyes. "If you did see Victor before the business trip, as you claimed before, how do you explain this photo? You claimed you left before he left, but this photo tells a different story." Lexi froze. She realized that her lie had been exposed. The detectives looked at her intently, their gazes leaving her no choice. She couldn't answer like before. I was just scared," she whispered, feeling her voice shake. "My friends and I were at his place, but I left later than everyone else. When I came back, he was already dead. There was nothing I could do. And yet, you chose to cover it up," the other detective said firmly. "And you're lying to us again. Lexi, we know you weren't in the apartment when he died, but you went back there later. We believe you know exactly what happened that night." A wave of fear flooded her. She realized that there was no retreat, and that now the detectives were getting closer and closer to the truth. She lowered her gaze and spoke softly. "We were there, yes, all my friends, Tony. We just wanted to have a party. Victor was away and I thought I could invite them over. We didn't know it would turn out like this." The detectives exchanged glances, sensing they were getting closer to the confession they'd been waiting for. One of them leaned forward and asked, "Tell us exactly what happened. Why did you and your friends leave without calling for help? And what happened to Victor?" Lexi took a deep breath, feeling a chill run down her spine. She knew that this truth would change everything, but she also realized there was nowhere else to retreat. "When Victor came back, he was angry," she began in a shaky voice. "He started yelling at us, especially me. He yelled that I had betrayed him, that he wouldn't let me even go near his house anymore. I didn't know what to do. But Tony couldn't stand it." She fell silent, as if trying to find words that wouldn't look like a straight lie. "What did Tony do?" the detective asked with pressure, encouraging her to continue. Lexi glared at the detective and then covered her face with her hands, realizing there was no more hiding the truth. "Tony pushed him when Victor yelled at us," she said quietly. "Victor lost his footing, slipped, and fell into the display case. I saw him lying there bleeding, but I just couldn't do anything. None of us could." She fell silent, her eyes staring off to the side, as if she no longer saw the detectives in front of her. The confession had come out of her on its own, but now she felt a weight that seemed to weigh on her shoulders. The detectives looked over to each other, realizing that they now had a confession to build a chain of events. Under pressure, Lexi had finally revealed the truth about what had really happened that night, and now they could turn to Tony to corroborate her words. "Lexi," the detective said after a pause, "you realize that by hiding all of this, you've become an accessory. But what's most important now is the truth. Tony may not plead guilty if he thinks you said something wrong. Are you prepared to give all the evidence you need?" She nodded silently, feeling there was no turning back. Now the detectives had the whole picture. Victor's death was unintentional, But Lexi and her friends had tried to cover up the incident, fearing justice. After Lexi's confession, the detectives immediately contacted Tony. He was called in for questioning, this time with the firm intention of getting a definitive statement that would conclude the case. Unlike Lexi, Tony was confident, and when they sat him down at the table, there was no hint of anxiety. He expected the usual questions and was confident that he could stick to his story. However, the detective started right away with the main point. "Tony, we know what happened that night," the detective began, watching his reaction carefully. "We know that you and Lexi were there together, and that Victor didn't die by accident." Tony frowned, his gaze becoming wary, but he tried to remain firm. "I already told you everything," he said sharply. "We just came in, had a drink, and left. Victor wasn't even there then. He was away on a business trip, and he let Lexi invite us over. We saw the picture from the safe, Tony," the detective continued, not giving him a chance to dodge. "Lexi came back after your party to pick up the money, and she told us exactly what happened that night. She said that you were the one who pushed Victor." Tony's face became hesitant, instantly losing his previous confidence. His eyes darted to the side, he bit his lip, and his hands clenched into fists for a moment. It was an accident," he finally said, lowering his voice. "We just wanted him to stop yelling. Victor came at us. Yeah, I pushed him, but I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Tony's voice shook, and he struggled to speak. The detectives nodded silently as they listened to his testimony. They realized that pressing his guilt was the right move. One of them asked, "Do you realize, Tony, that your leaving without calling for help led to his death? That if you had called the police, Victor might still be alive?" Tony pressed his lips together and looked away, realizing the gravity of his actions. He seemed to be slowly but surely realizing the consequences of what had happened. For the first time, he looked humbled. I was afraid. Everyone was afraid. No one knew what to do," he mumbled, avoiding looking the detective in the eye. "Lexi said we couldn't stay here, that we'd be blamed, and I did what she said." The detectives exchanged glances, knowing that they now had enough evidence for a final conviction. Tony's confession and Lexi's testimony revealed the full picture of the tragedy. Because of fear, anger, and panic, they had left Victor bleeding to death without calling for help or making any attempt to undo what they had done. After questioning Tony and his confession, detectives wrapped up the case, charging him with manslaughter and Lexi with covering up the crime and obstruction of justice. These charges shook up the small town, and everyone began to discuss the strange death of wealthy Victor and his dangerous affair with a young girl. The court hearings went by quickly enough. Tony's confession and the photograph from the safe proved to be irrefutable evidence, and the lawyers had no opportunity to refute the facts. In the end, Tony received a sentence for manslaughter, and Lexi was sentenced to several years for attempting to cover up the circumstances of the crime. Her crime also put a heavy burden on her reputation in future. Walking down the court corridor after the sentencing, Lexi avoided the gazes of those around her. Her previously serene calm was replaced by the realization that her decision had left a mark not only on her life, but on her friends as well. Faced with the consequences of her actions, she finally realized that trying to hide the truth was her worst choice. This is how the tragedy ended, and no one involved in the story was ever able to return to their former lives.